Welcome back to the Discernment Lab. Today's explainer is jumping right into a really fascinating contrast: the fleeting illusion of worldly happiness versus the absolute unshakable anchor of true biblical joy. If you've ever felt like you're just endlessly chasing the good life, but somehow always coming up a bit short, well, this analysis is going to be incredibly illuminating. We're going to look closely at what the source texts reveal about how we actually process our emotions and ultimately our circumstances.
All right, so here is the roadmap for today's explainer. We'll start with the pursuit of happiness, move on to happiness versus true joy, look at the true source of joy, examine joy in the dark, and finish up with cultivating a joyful life. Let's get right to it.
Section 1. The pursuit of happiness, chasing circumstances. So we're starting with a pretty universal human condition, right? So much of our culture is literally built on this frantic pursuit of the good life. We try so hard to manufacture the perfect circumstances, assuming that they'll just automatically yield fulfillment. But as our sources point out, this kind of relentless pleasure-seeking actually leaves a lot of people feeling unexpectedly empty.
And what's really wild is that the very etymology of the word happiness proves just how fragile it actually is. It derives from the Old English root hap, which literally means luck or happenings. Think about what that implies. It means happiness is an emotion that just rises and falls entirely based on what is happening to you on any given day. It basically leaves you at the total mercy of your circumstances.
According to our texts, happiness is essentially just a thermometer. Just like a literal thermometer simply reflects the temperature of the room, going up when it's warm and dropping when it's cold, happiness simply registers our daily luck. Your team wins or you get a raise, boom, the thermometer shoots up. You face a sudden setback, it plummets right back down. It's totally an outside job, completely dependent on the unpredictable weather of your life.
Which brings us to Section 2, Happiness versus True Joy, the cinematic contrast. Here, we really need to completely separate those temporary, surface-level emotions from the permanent, deep-seated state of being that the sources define as joy.
This framework brilliantly illustrates the core difference. Happiness is a temporary state of mind, right? It's completely dependent and conditional. True joy, on the other hand, is a constant mindset. It is completely independent of your surroundings and utterly unconditional. Actually, scratch that. It's not just a mindset, it's a foundation. You don't lose it just because you hit a financial crisis or experience a personal heartbreak. Joy is what stays with you for the long haul.
The whole point is captured perfectly by author Bill Bright. He says, happiness is like the moon. It waxes and wanes, constantly changing its shape based on its position. But joy? Joy is like the sun. Even when the darkest clouds of life roll in and you literally can't see it, you know that sun is still there. It's burning hot and constant in the background. It never actually stops shining. Breaking down the language even further, the texts point out this fascinating connection in the original Greek. So, the word for grace is charis, and the word for joy is chara. They're essentially twins, born from the exact same root. What this means is that biblical joy is, at its absolute core, grace enjoyed. It's an inward response to a permanent gift, rather than just some outward reaction to temporary luck. And to inject just a bit of levity here, the sources share a really wonderful anecdote about translating the Bible for northern Alaskan Eskimos. Get this, they didn't actually have a native word for joy. So the translators had to look for the most delightful, genuinely joyful experience in the village. And you know what they realized it was? The moment the sled dogs were fed at night. So when the disciples saw the resurrected Jesus, the translator beautifully equated their joy to wagging their tails with delight. I just absolutely love that mental image. Moving on to Section 3, the true source of joy, the unwavering anchor. So, if joy isn't manufactured by having a perfectly lucky day, where exactly does this unwavering anchor come from? How do we actually get it? Well, our source texts indicate that true joy is strictly an inside job. It's rooted in remaining in the presence of Jesus and maintaining peace with God. Romans chapter 5 tells us that justification brings peace and peace brings joy. It's an internal posture. Think about it. If your joy comes from your possessions, a thief can just break in and steal your joy. But if your joy comes from the Lord, it is locked up in a sanctuary no thief could ever touch. This brings us to a really fascinating concept from our sources on cinematic storytelling. Film theory dictates that we experience a movie sequentially. We don't judge the entire story by one really tense, uncomfortable scene. We wait for the resolution. The biblical framework applies this exact same logic to life. In Hebrews 12, it says Jesus endured the cross for the joy set before him. He didn't find joy in the agonizing pain of the cross.
He found joy by focusing on the triumphant outcome that was coming sequentially after it. Joy is what allows us to look right through the tough scenes of our own lives, totally trusting the final joyful resolution.
Which leads right into Section 4, Joy in the Dark, the Crucible of Suffering. Now we really have to test this concept of joy in the crucible to see how it holds up. I mean, it's one thing to talk about joy when things are going relatively smoothly, but what happens when the world seemingly falls apart?
This incredible historical artifact, found in the ruins of the Mamertine prison in Rome, answers that exact question. Written during a time of intense Roman persecution, where believers were literally facing the Colosseum, an anonymous writer noted that despite being despised and hunted down, these Christians possessed a joy 1,000 times better than the world's pleasures. It just brilliantly illustrates that genuine joy doesn't just survive in the darkest dungeons, it absolutely thrives there.
This fundamentally redefines resilience for us. We so often pray for God to just take our problems away so we can be happy again, right? But according to theologian Adrian Rogers, joy is not the subtraction of problems. Rather, it's the addition of divine power to meet those problems head-on. As Charles Spurgeon noted in our texts, joy acts as a sweet, comforting medicine for the weary soul, right smack in the middle of the struggle.
All right, let's bring it all together in Section 5, Cultivating a Joyful Life, the Lab Findings. Let's dive into the practical application. How do we actually do this? Let's look at the actionable lab findings from our sources on how we can actively cultivate this profound resilience in our own daily lives. Here we see a direct, side-by-side contrast between the exhausting pursuit of worldly happiness and the inward transformation of biblical joy. The world says, hoard your possessions, seek out good luck, and focus entirely on yourself. But the biblical practice is literally the exact opposite. It's all about generous giving, intentionally abiding in God as your source regardless of luck, and actively turning your focus outward to serve others.
In fact, the sources present this incredibly practical, choice-based framework for expressing joy. Notice the common verb here, give. You cultivate joy by giving thanks in all circumstances, not just the good ones. You give away material possessions because, let's face it, hoarding destroys joy. You give your time to serve others, and you give hope by sharing your faith. Joy is something that grows internally, but it absolutely must flow outward.
Ultimately, joy isn't just a fleeting feeling we sit around and wait for. It's a daily, intentional posture of the heart that we must actively choose to adopt. It means basing our confidence on the unchanging Word of God, not our fluctuating bank accounts or our health. It means keeping a clean conscience. And practically speaking, it means turning off the noisy distractions, like mindlessly binge-watching Netflix, and actively turning up our worship, walking step by step in obedience.
As we wrap up today's explainer, I want to leave you with a final, challenging thought to help you evaluate your own emotional anchor. In an incredibly unpredictable world, where circumstances literally change by the hour, are you going to keep riding the exhausting roller coaster of chasing lucky happiness? Or are you ready to choose the deep, unwavering anchor of true joy? The choice is entirely yours.